Well, good evening. It's good to see all of you. You have your Bible with you. If you have your Bible with you, go ahead and open up to Daniel, book of Daniel. That's where we're going to be again this evening for our lesson. I figure since we read all of Daniel chapter 5, while it's fresh in our mind, we'll get another lesson from the book of Daniel. But this time, I don't want to focus on one story in particular. I want to focus on the book of Daniel as a whole. As a whole, what does this book teach us? What is the point of this book? I'm going to just go ahead and answer that for you right now. The big point of the book of Daniel is to teach us that all things come to an end, especially kingdoms. And Daniel teaches us this through the kingdom of Babylon. Throughout Daniel, we see over and over again hints that Babylon is going to fall, that this kingdom isn't going to stand forever. And this starts off early on in the book of Daniel. Let's go to Daniel chapter 1, and we'll start to see some of these hints that kingdoms don't last forever, even the Babylonian kingdom. Daniel chapter 1, and we're going to start reading from verse 1 here. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God." So early on, right here in the book, we see one kingdom coming to an end, the kingdom of Judah, right? The Israelite nation, they've been taken captive. So this is one kingdom that has fallen. Continuing on in verse 3, "Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish." And then if we drop down to verse 6, we start to see who those youths are. "Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah." So these verses sort of set the scene for the book of Daniel. We see that King Nebuchadnezzar, he destroys Judah, essentially destroys Jerusalem, takes some people captive, among them Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And after we're introduced to all of this information, the author, the Holy Spirit, gives us a subtle hint about the fate of Babylon. Look at verse 21, the last verse of chapter 1. Verse 21, it says, "And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus." Now, we are told that Nebuchadnezzar took Daniel, right? Nebuchadnezzar took them into captivity, and Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon, right? And we see that Daniel stayed there until the first year of the King Cyrus, and King Cyrus was king over the nation of Persia, right? So very early on in the book, we see some hints about Babylon's downfall. And this just continues. It continues on into chapter 2, doesn't it? For the most part, we're familiar with chapter 2. We've been learning about that since Bible class. This is where King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of this statue. This statue is made of gold, it's made of silver, it's made of bronze, it's made of iron, and then iron and clay at the bottom. And he doesn't know what to make of this dream. So he calls all of his smart people, right, all of the well-educated, all of the wise men, the people from Harvard and Yale, if you will, and he says, "I want you guys to figure this dream out for me." And they say, "Okay, well, sure, tell us the dream." And he says, "No." And they say, "Well, we can't interpret the dream." And he sort of responds by saying, "Well, that's fine, I'm just going to kill all of you." And that's when Daniel sort of steps in, Daniel and the three friends, and they say, "Hold on, we can interpret this dream for you." And that's where we pick up in chapter 2 and verse 36. Chapter 2 and verse 36. It says, "This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, and into whose hands he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you ruler over them all." He says, "You are the head of gold." So Daniel and the three boys tell King Nebuchadnezzar, "You and your kingdom, Babylon, you are the head of gold." But in verse 39, he says, "Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth." So here in chapter 2, we see it again. Some more hints that Babylon is not going to last forever. There are going to be kingdoms that come after Babylon, kingdoms that take over after them. And this continues in Daniel chapter 4. Let's go there. Daniel chapter 4. In this context, Nebuchadnezzar, he's being punished because of his pride. And starting in verse 25 or so, we see exactly what happens to him. Starting in verse 25 of Daniel chapter 4, it says, "You shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he wills." Daniel here tells King Nebuchadnezzar that God is the one who rules, and God has the power to give you this kingdom and to take it away from you as well. So throughout Daniel, we see these hints over and over again that Babylon is going to fall. And all of these hints that we see in chapter 1, in chapter 2, in chapter 3, we didn't cover that one, and in chapter 4, all of them culminate in Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5, where Babylon actually falls. In this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar is no longer king. Instead, it's his son Belshazzar. Belshazzar is king, and this chapter covers the last day of his reign. On the very next day, he would lose not only his kingdom, but he would also lose his life. I heard some people saying it exactly right. He would also lose his life. Now, I want you to imagine with me for a minute being a citizen of Babylon at this point in history. Imagine with me for a second being a citizen of Babylon and watching the enemy plunge through the wall that you have trusted your entire life, the wall that has protected you since you've been born. Imagine watching the enemy essentially destroy your world, the world that you know. How would you feel in that situation? Well, I don't know about you guys, but in my opinion, it would feel like my world was coming to an end. The world as I know it, as I knew it, were coming to an end. And in that moment, I think I would realize what was truly important. And that's what we're going to talk about in the lesson tonight. Daniel teaches us that the kingdoms of the world and the world itself doesn't last forever. It will come to an end. And when that moment comes, when the world ends, there are going to be some things that don't matter. And the people who put their trust in the things that don't matter will ultimately be disappointed. And I don't want that for me. I don't want that for you guys. So we're going to talk tonight about some things that won't matter when the world ends. So what are those things? Well, first of all, when the world ends, my wealth won't matter. You know, we see this clearly in the book of Daniel. Go to Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4. We're going to read verse 4. This is sort of Nebuchadnezzar speaking here. Daniel chapter 4 and verse 4 says, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace." You know, this is sort of the picture of wealth. When you are at ease, when you're at rest, when you don't have to work, but you're still prospering, you're wealthy. When you don't have to work, your money is just working for you, yeah, you're a pretty wealthy person. And that's who King Nebuchadnezzar was. King Nebuchadnezzar, he was very, very wealthy. And that's not surprising because he was a king, right? You know, kings in the ancient world, they were wealthy people. They weren't typically very poor. So King Nebuchadnezzar was also wealthy. Well, when his world came to an end, you know, in a literary sense, what happened to his wealth? Here, let's read, picking up in verse 30. Actually, verse 31. Verse 31 of Daniel chapter 4. It says, "While these words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, 'O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field.'" Here, God takes King Nebuchadnezzar essentially away from his world. And when his world ended, well, his wealth meant nothing. His wealth couldn't save him. His wealth didn't matter. And Belshazzar, we see something similar with Belshazzar in chapter 5. Chapter 5, we'll start reading from verse 1. It says, "King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, and that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And then down in verse 4, it says they drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Well, here in these verses, we see something similar. Belshazzar, he is a very wealthy king. I mean, how much money does it take to feed 1,000 people? That takes a lot of money, right? You know, I don't even want to know how much you guys spend on devos whenever you invite the high schoolers over. Feeding 1,000 people is going to cost quite a bit. So we see Belshazzar, he's very wealthy. But what happens in the end? When Persia comes in and destroys his kingdom and kills him ultimately, what did his wealth do for him? Nothing. His wealth, in the end, it didn't matter. And this is a lesson that we need to learn because so much of our world and our culture is driven by wealth. It's just an important part. It's such an important part of our culture. Think about it this way. We start sending kids to school at 5 years old, right? Kindergarten. And if you're really proactive, you send them in at 4 and they call it preschool or whatever it may be. And why do we start sending kids to school starting in kindergarten? Well, it's so that they will get good grades and make it into a good college, right? So that they'll get good grades in college and eventually land a good job. Essentially, it's so that they can be productive participants in the economy, right? So that they can make good money and support themselves. So from a very early age, we start thinking about children and their ability to support themselves and their ability to make money. Why? Well, because money is important in our society. And think about the way that we measure success. You look at the lawyer who's making a couple $1 million every year, and we say, well, that person's successful, right? He's making all of this money. He's got all of the things. He's doing well for himself. But maybe we look at someone else, maybe we look at a police officer or a firefighter, some first responder making 30, 40, 50,000 a year, and we say, oh, they're doing okay, but they're not as successful as this lawyer. See, sometimes we measure success by wealth, and why? Well, because wealth is very important in our society, and that mentality has almost made its way into the church in some sense. It's had an impact on us as God's people because we sometimes view money as more important than it really is. Let's go to the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 5, please. Isaiah chapter 5, in verse 8. In the context, the Lord here is describing woes, and it seems to be that the woe is on excess. Isaiah chapter 5, in verse 8. God says, woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field until there is no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. So here, God says, woe to the man who adds house to house. He's describing this very wealthy person, right? This wealthy person who has a lot of land, but you know what? That's not enough. So he needs to buy more land. But that's not enough. So he needs to buy more land and more land and more land. This person is never satisfied. He has to have the next new thing, the next new thing, and the next new thing. And God says in Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 8, woe to that man. You know, this verse essentially teaches us that there is a such thing. There is such a thing as too much. There's such a thing as having too many possessions to where it blinds us to what's truly important, doing God's will. Or are we like this man sometimes that we see in Isaiah chapter 5? Are we like the man who has to add house to house, field to field, who has to have the next new thing? Oh, I just need this new car. Or I need the next, iPhone i65 and Samsung Galaxy S30. Are we like that person who's never really satisfied? God here teaches us that there is a such thing as too much. I don't know exactly where that line is for everyone. I think it's different for everyone, but there is a such thing as having too much to where it blinds us to God's will. It blinds us to what's truly important. Here in Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 8, this person has so much stuff that he's hurting others. Other people are driven away and he's alone. We need to be careful that we're not like this man. Is my wealth so important that I'm not willing to sacrifice like the rich young ruler? Now, the fact of the matter is, when the world ends, my wealth it's not really going to matter. And if we think about it, the money that we have today, well, it could be worthless tomorrow. Now, I think about the Civil War. During the Civil War, the Confederacy started circulating their own currency, and the people who supported the Confederacy, they obviously bought into that currency, and they bought into that currency with the hope that it would maintain and hold its value. And obviously, when the war ended, that currency was worthless. It wasn't worth anything. And those people who bought in, they lost their money. They lost their possessions. When the end came, when the end of their world, when the end of the Confederacy came, their money was worthless. They had nothing. And the same thing could happen to us one day. Remember, the big lesson of Daniel is that kingdoms don't last forever. And when the world comes back, well, the world's going to end, but the kingdom of America might not last that long. And one day our money might just be worth nothing. So we need to focus less on wealth. If you're wealthy, great. If you're not wealthy, that's fine too. But just rest assured, when the world ends, the wealth isn't going to matter. But that's not all. When the world ends, my power won't matter. And the idea behind this is that power just comes and goes. God is the one with true power. My power is not going to matter when the world ends. And we see this in Daniel. We see this in Belshazzar's life. Actually, in Daniel chapter 4, in Nebuchadnezzar's life. In Daniel chapter 4, God tells Nebuchadnezzar, hey, you're being very prideful. You're being very prideful, and if you don't fix your pride, I'm going to remove you from your kingdom, right? I'm going to remove you from your kingdom, and I'm going to take it away from you. Well, instead of listening to God, it seems like Nebuchadnezzar, he trusted in his own power. Let's pick up in verse 29 of Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4. And we'll look here at verse 29. It says, at the end of the 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered and said, is this not Babylon the great, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence for the glory of my majesty? And then, while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. God tells Nebuchadnezzar, hey, if you don't fix your pride, I'm going to take the kingdom away from you. And then King Nebuchadnezzar says, well, look at this kingdom that I built with my power. See, he was so focused on his own power that he failed to realize that he could not overpower God. You see, power comes and goes. And we see that with Daniel and his three friends. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, let's pick up in verse 3. It says, the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility. And then down in verse 6, we see Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were of the tribe of Judah. So these verses teach us that Daniel and his three friends, they were from nobility, right? Of the tribe of Judah, they were of royal lineage. So it's likely that they had some power. It's likely that they had some social status. But when King Nebuchadnezzar came in and sort of ended their world, well, what happened to that power? It was gone. Didn't really matter. And we see this again in Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5, this is with Daniel, regarding Daniel after he interprets the writing on the wall for Belshazzar. Daniel chapter 5, starting in verse 29, it says, then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be third ruler in the kingdom. So Daniel was given great power. All right, third ruler in the kingdom, that's pretty high up there. But what happened the very next day when Babylon was gone? He lost that power. That power was gone. See, when the world ends, we need to understand that power won't matter. As Daniel reminds us, God is the one with the true power, and we need to rely on him. It doesn't matter if I'm this great CEO, if I'm sitting at the best seat in that conference room. I'm not powerful enough to overcome God. And it doesn't matter if I'm the janitor working at that company who's not even invited into the conference room. If I have no power, that's okay too, because I need to rely on God's power. I'm afraid that we get so caught up in earthly power that we think we have to use our own power to fix all of our problems. And I think that's why Christians get sucked into politics. Man, if we just get this person in office, he can fix all of our problems. Guys, we need to rely less on our power and rely more on the power of God. As the wise man once said, I tried so hard and got so far. But at the end, it doesn't even matter. Just kidding. That's a song. But the point is, when the world ends, my power is not going to matter. But that's all. That's not all I have for you. I've got one more point. When the world ends, my truth won't matter. Now, someone might say, Reuben, what are you saying? Are you saying truth doesn't matter when the world ends? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying my truth won't matter. We live in this world where you get to have your truth, and I get to have my truth, and it's all good. It's all fine. Well, when the world ends, it's not my truth or your truth that's going to matter. It's the truth that's going to matter. But Nebuchadnezzar, he didn't understand this. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 2. This is where we have that dream where we see the statue made of the gold and the silver and the bronze and the iron, and then the iron and the clay. And this is essentially God's way of telling Nebuchadnezzar that his kingdom is going to come to an end. God tells Nebuchadnezzar in this chapter, you are the gold. You are the head of gold. Your kingdom is the gold kingdom. But there's going to be another kingdom after you, and it's going to be the silver kingdom. But your gold kingdom is not going to last. And that was God's truth for King Nebuchadnezzar. Well, did Nebuchadnezzar believe God's truth? No, he didn't. Instead, Nebuchadnezzar created his own truth. Let's go to chapter 3 and verse 1. Daniel chapter 3 and verse 1, it says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. So here God says, you're the kingdom of gold, but there's going to be a kingdom that follows you. And Nebuchadnezzar responds by saying, well, no, it's not. My gold kingdom is going to last forever. That was Nebuchadnezzar's truth. You see, he relied on his own truth rather than relying on God's. And Belshazzar was like this as well. Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5 was told that his kingdom was going to come to an end. And he was told who was going to do it. He was told that the Persians, they were going to come in and they were going to take his kingdom. And the thing was, the Persians were the ones right outside of his gates. God tells Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5 that the enemy right outside of your gates, they're the enemy that's going to take your kingdom from you. Did Belshazzar listen? Did Belshazzar listen to the truth? In my opinion, he doesn't. Because what does he do at the end of the chapter? He gives Daniel these clothes, his purple chains, and he makes Daniel third ruler in the kingdom. Seems like he's not even concerned about the enemy right outside the gate. Instead, he's appointing new rulers. Both Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar were told that Babylon would come to an end. But they didn't believe the truth. They had their own truth. But what happened? Babylon came to an end. And when their world ended, Nebuchadnezzar's truth, Belshazzar's truth, it didn't matter. And this is a lesson that we need to learn because this is how our world is. Our world is just like Nebuchadnezzar. Our world is just like Belshazzar. God can tell us something, and then the world responds by saying, well, I have my own truth. In Genesis, when God makes man and woman, it says he made them male and female. Now, the world can read that, but the world says, I have my own truth about that. And it seems like we have replaced objective biology for subjective sociology. Now you could sort of just be whatever you want. That's your truth. And along those same lines, God has said that homosexuality is clearly wrong. I'm not going to go into that, not going to look at all the verses, but they're there. But the world says, and even some Christians say, God didn't say that. God accepts this sort of thing. You see, we live in a world where the truth essentially doesn't exist. It's your truth, and it's my truth, and it's his truth, and that person's truth over there, and it's all okay. And this doesn't only affect the world. This affects us as well. And what happens when we fall into the trap of drunkenness or pornography or some other addiction? What happens then? Well, it's like we're looking at God and saying, your truth doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you said A man should not lust after a woman in his heart. It doesn't matter that you said that. I have my own truth. I'm going to do what I want to do. See, when we don't live according to God's will, we are essentially saying, I have my own truth. We need to listen to Daniel on this. When the world ends, my truth isn't going to matter. And that's the point. That's the point, guys. There are a lot of things that won't matter in the end. But what will matter? Let's go to Daniel chapter 2 again. Daniel chapter 2, we're going to pick up at verse 44. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44, it says, and this is while Daniel and the three boys are interpreting the dream of all the kingdoms coming. It says, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end. It shall stand forever. After God finishes telling Nebuchadnezzar that his kingdom and these other kingdoms are going to come to an end, he also tells Nebuchadnezzar that there's going to be a kingdom that stands forever. In the end, my wealth, my power, my truth, it's not going to matter. What will matter is God's kingdom, God's truth, God's power, and the blessings that God gives us. Because these kingdoms and these other things, they're all going to be done away with. But God's kingdom will last forever. Maybe there's someone here tonight who wants to be a part of that kingdom. The kingdom that lasts forever. The kingdom that will never be done away with. If you want to be a part of that kingdom, we could help you out with that. If you want to become a child of God tonight, we could help you out. Or maybe you've left the Lord and you want to be, again, seen as a citizen of the kingdom. Well, we'd love to help you out with that as well. If you need to respond to the invitation, you can come now as we stand and as we sing.